are with Professor Barry Cooper today. He is the editor of the most recent ABRSM edition of the Beethoven Sonatas, entitled 35 Piano Sonatas. He is the author and co-author and editor of numerous publications and is one of the most respected Beethoven researchers in the world today. So thank you, Barry, for joining me today for this talk about the piano sonatas.
Thank you very much for your invitation, and I'm delighted to be here with you.
What were some of the things, or if there's one event that helped you determine why Beethoven? Is there something that captured you even to this day to keep going with this amount of scholarship and this dedication to Beethoven?
Well, it originated when I was a graduate student, and luckily I had Professor Joseph Kerman, as my head of music in Oxford at the time, and he was a Beethoven scholar. And he also brought in Dr. Alan Tyson, who's a very great Beethoven scholar as well. And those two ran a sort of seminar on Beethoven. I thought this looked rather interesting, even though it wasn't my main area of research at the time. And I quickly realized that there's so much to be found out about Beethoven, and so much that can be found out about Beethoven that hasn't yet been, that it would take me several lifetimes to get through all things I wanted to find out. So I started working on Beethoven more and more. And the other thing was that people were generally interested when I told them I was working on Beethoven. Previously, I'd been working on Albertus Brine. Well, nobody knew much about him, and so that was the end of the conversation. But when I started talking, when I say I was working on Beethoven, they always wanted to know what I was finding out and what I was looking for. And so this is where it got started, thanks to Joseph Kerman and Alan Tyson.
I was reading through some of your writings, and I know that you might have been disappointed sometimes at the end of your search to find out, oh, that was just hearsay. I think you mentioned that Schindler's quotes and stories often did not turn out to be what you thought. And maybe this kind of research and this kind of detective work that you were applying to his life, you were also applying to analyzing the piano sonatas. And with this new ABRSM edition, you had made thousands of corrections. I know that you were working on some composition as well, because you have done a version of a completion of Beethoven Symphony No. 10. So you're looking at it from a scholarship point of view, you're looking at it from a composer point of view. And I found out that you also did work with vocal groups, and so you have extensive knowledge of all sorts of instruments. What is your wish for us performers? What is the biggest takeaway that you would like us to look into, and why are we drawn into your edition?
Well, if you're performing Beethoven, as far as I'm concerned, you can perform it how you like. You can miss bits out, you can transpose it, you can change a few notes if you like. You can do whatever you like with it, because the music is strong enough to withstand almost any maltreatment that people might give it, and it has done. But I think some people want to perform the music as Beethoven intended, because that's where you get a sense of direct communication between the composer and the listener via the performer. So if you want to perform the music as Beethoven intended, as some people do, well, there are certain things you have to do and certain things you mustn't do, and certain things it's not clear whether you should do them or not. And so that's my addition, is trying to tell them, if you want to perform it as Beethoven intended, these are the things you need to know. So I was putting all those things into my edition, rather than I say you don't have to follow them, because you can do it whatever you like. But if you want to do it as Beethoven intended, I hope some people will, then this is what you must do. My edition was meant to guide you, because the average pianist won't know these things and needs to be told.
I'm hoping that if you do hear the entire set, I know that you heard the Arietta from my collection, but I do hope that I was as faithful as I could have been. One of the interesting discoveries is that when I am working on so many sonatas simultaneously, of course they weren't all done at the same time, it was across a certain number of years, you start cross-referencing and you can start hearing similarities, and you can hear with this sonata he's using this unique idea, and he's seeing how far we can take this. You start being able to make these comparisons that I wasn't making as carefully when you are looking at one and digging into it. I could spend a whole lifetime trying to get to the bottom of one sonata, and depending on the day, depending on your age, depending on your life experience, you could also read different things into it. Maybe having heard, you're just fresh off of hearing Beethoven later, and you come back. So we were talking about the theme of the Arietta, And I was wondering, why is it that I'm hearing it a certain way in this slowness? Because you take the theme and it's cantabile, and from our correspondence, I was hearing it a little bit on the slower side. Of course, we were all taking into consideration things to do with breathing. What if it were on the voice? How would it be treated?
Part of the slowness is that some editions show it as adagio molto, but it's molto semplice. It's not adagio molto, it's adagio and molto semplice. So my edition had to put that right first. And once you see it's just adagio, not adagio molto, it suggests it shouldn't be quite as slow as some people take it. And then, as you say, if you're going to sing it, well, if you try singing that phrase in one breath at too slow a speed, you will simply run out of breath. So there's a certain natural speed, which I think if you sing it, you'll get that speed. As you sing the first line over and over again, you'll soon get the feel of this really doesn't work because I've got to take a breath in the middle of a note here, a little bit faster, and I can manage it. So that's how I would go about assessing the speed of that movement. Because and what I find is that most pianists take it very much slower than that, as though they sort of feel this is sort of a grand sort of final movement that Beethoven ever composed for
That's
in
right.
his sonatas, and therefore make more of it. But of course, he didn't see it that way. He actually described this sonata as not very difficult. So, I think the one's got to sort of remove some of the sort of aura of sentimentality around that arietta and treat it as an arietta, not even a cavatina, which is a sort of very slow aria. This is an arietta, which is sort of a relatively light sort of aria, in fact, compared with the cavatina. So I always think that it should go just perhaps a shade faster than most people take it.
I was thinking, I wish I knew what the words, if there were words set to this. So when the le bévol is when we have it's just one word stretched into three syllables, then that's quite slow. Um, so I was hearing it a little bit. Take a breath, and then.
Yeah. The next phrase is all in one breath.
That's right. The next
Da,
one has to be.
da, 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 da. And
That's
by the
right.
time you sung those six notes, you were out of breath, and if you take it too slow.
Yes. And then I thought, well, would it have been a vocal line? It could have been for another instrument as well. Because it's not in the, it could be a
Yeah.
woodwind. Um,
It's a wonder people haven't had added words to that, because they've added words to all sorts of things. I mean, some of Bach's fugues have got words added, rather nutty words usually added to Bach's fugues. It's a wonder they haven't done it to this, but as far as I know, they haven't. Perhaps they will one day, but whatever words they add, they'll destroy the music rather than enhance it, I suspect.
well, you've planted the seed. Some people might start doing this now. Uh, but the transposed. I was listening to Andi Ferne Geliebte, because speaking of the final thing or some sentimentality that we have about the arietta because it's the last one. Um,
Yeah.
I'm a little bit guilty of that as well, but it's in in the transposed C major key, which is
Yeah.
correlated to the arietta. That's kind of how I hear it. The G's, the repeating, the, the pedal point there. Um,
Yeah, but
not
the
not as
anti-Galita should be an Galita should be an E flat major, not
it
C
should be.
major. And I get quite annoyed when I hear it in the wrong key, actually, because Beethoven's very specific about what key he writes these things in. And if you put it in a C major, it not only makes the left hand far too muddy and low pitch, but it also destroys the sort of key associations, because C major doesn't really go with the sentiments of Andy van der Geliebte.
I kind of like the Fischer Dieskau's recording, and he does do it in C because
He does, yes.
he does it beautifully.
Oh,
Um,
yes.
but I know that with keys can color. What bothers me is how easily singers often go to pieces and say, "I want it in this key. It's too low for me." And rather than changing pieces or finding other things that would suit that would
Yeah.
fit their fog, they
Yeah.
would go and just change the keys.
But
So
they
he's
don't
trying.
do that in operas very much, do they? I mean, in an opera, you can't suddenly say, "Right, I'm going to put this bit down a tone," because you've got everything else around it. So I've never heard "Larci da Re la mano" from from Don Giovanni in any key except A major, because it doesn't. It's got to be an A major because that's the key of the surrounding material. So if you can do it in operas, you can do it with songs too. On the whole, I say, and I've even, in my latest investigation on Defender Galicia, I've even suggested that rather than put it down, keep it in the original key. And if a couple of notes are too high, and it doesn't go very high and not for very long, we'll just change those two notes and sing a low note in the chord. And then you
Yes.
only sort of spoil a few notes very slightly rather than spoiling the entire song cycle for the sake of a few high notes.
So that's interesting to hear you say, because people would have assumed that someone from your musicological background would say, "Oh no, sacrilege! We can't change any of the notes." Um,
Well, you've changed a whole lot of you. As soon as you transpose, you've changed every single note.
yes. So another thing that I noticed working across a lot of sonatas is just one more thing with the this again is the ending of the Andiferne Geliebte.
Mm.
We have and this is Andante Favori, da 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 da, different
Yeah.
key. But I'm looking at it in C major, so I need to go back and look at it in the original key. Um, but it's not just that. But one of the interesting things about one of the most interesting things about including the three sonatas that are usually not included is how much they feel like it's a part of his development, how much it feels like one of the family, because you hear, oh wow, this sounds like the Pathétique, or you hear parts of the theme that appears in one of the later sonatas as well. I'm sure you noticed this as you were working on this, probably more than I have. You've been sitting on these for longer than I
Yeah.
have.
Yeah, I did notice, particularly the second one, the F minor one, is very striking because there he brings back the slow introduction just before the recap. And that's something which composers hadn't really done before. And it was such a good idea from this 12-year-old that he did it quite a few more times in the Pathétique Sonata, as you mentioned, and even in his very last quartet, the Musa Sign, he does exactly the same thing there for 30 or 40 years later. Extraordinary.
I mean, the rhythm is kind of similar as well, because you start with a strong minor chord, followed by dotted notes, then suspension. This pattern is then repeated. The Pathétique does something similar. And then the fast part also has similarities. An energetic repeating bass, and it has this drive about it, this avanti feel, like the Pathétique. The newest pieces to me were the three uh, younger pieces. Now, Emil Gilels had already recorded them. He didn't record the entire sonata set, but he was already exposing us to those sonatas back then, so he saw merit in them. It's different from, I saw on IMSLP someone had, is a power edition. He calls it the 38 Beethoven sonatas, and I thought, how
Yeah.
did I miss this? What is this? And so I thought, what did I miss here? So somewhere around page 400, you're scrolling. This is sonatinas. This is
Yes.
sonatinas.
Two
That
spurious sonatinas, yeah, or two of the sonatinas, which one's not really a sonata at all, yeah.
that's right, and it's not
Yeah.
100% certain that Beethoven even wrote those
Well,
pieces.
the two sonatinas he probably didn't write, but it's just possible he did. But there are an awful lot of things which strike me as not quite right for Beethoven in those two very short sonatinas. But there are two other sonatinas, which are sometimes called sonatinas, aren't really sonatinas. The C major one, which he wrote for an instrument called an Orphica, sort of portable piano, and there's an F major one, which is really just two movements on back to back on a single page. So not really full scale sonata. Yeah.
Yes. So I wanted to mention that the three sonatas that you did include, they feel like full-on sonatas. They are developed. They have movements. They are self-contained, and
Well, yes. I mean, he published them as sonatas at the time. The other three he didn't. He did publish those three as sonatas at the time. They're called sonatas. They've each got three movements. They're longer than the shortest of his other sonatas, So I can't see anything that stops them being sonatas. They're called sonatas. He published them as sonatas. They are sonatas. Well, why aren't they there?
And another burning question I think a lot of people would have is, have your views on how to approach Beethoven's markings changed from previous editions that you think would be worth noting here? Because most people will not be buying the three sets and looking through them meticulously. But are there certain things that you would like us to know about?
Well, certainly the actual text itself. I put, right, as you say, quite a few little details here and there. Um, One of the things I would encourage people to do particularly is to play the grace notes on the beat rather than before the beat, because nearly everyone plays them before the beat, but Beethoven evidently intended them to be on the beat and very often to be long as well. And nowadays, people are making them shorter and shorter rather than longer and longer, which distresses me slightly. Particularly, it happens in the Seventh Symphony, where they're tending to rush the grace note in the slow movement. But Beethoven apparently intended all the grace notes to be played on the beat and to last as long as the grace note showed, and the main note takes up whatever's left. And I wrote an article about this 20 years ago, but it still hasn't got through to most pianists for whatever reason, and I'm not quite sure why not. I mean, one said I'm too old to change and things like that, and others say, well, no one plays it like that on the recording. Well, no, they don't, but they should do. And and Beethoven got these ideas, I think, mainly from the C.P. Bach book, the essay on the true art of playing keyboard music, or Die wahre Art, das Klavier zu spielen. And when I looked into that book, C.P. Bach was saying exactly the same thing. In fact, he says that three times in one sentence, the grace note must be played on the beat and take up time from the main note, not from the previous note. And he says that in three different ways in the same sentence. So if it's a quaver grace note, it lasts a quaver, and then the main note takes up whatever's left.
So
But pianists not doing that.
uh,
And I get the impression that pianists are sort of slightly embarrassed. They sound sort of embarrassed by any kind of grace note, and get it out of the way as quickly as possible. And the only people who are doing it a little bit are singers, because with singer you have to do it, have to play it, sing it on the note, otherwise the syllable comes before the beat. So
that's
singers often do get the grace notes right, but the instrumentalists, especially violinists and to a certain extent pianists also, are tending to play the grace notes before the beat and get them out of the way as quickly as possible. Hope you won't notice, sort of thing, which is sort of almost as if they're embarrassed by it. And I say, enjoy these grace notes; they're lovely.
I, so speaking about singers, it could be, when they, especially in German, they try to get the consonants coming in early so that they land on the vowels on the
Yeah,
beat. So it's almost like the instrumentalists are treating the grace notes as though those were something you need to get out of the way to get to the main to get to the main event. But the note itself is an appoggiatura,
yeah,
or something that I love to hear the dissonances. I think we need dissonances, or we have no
absolutely. Yeah,
resolution. So those
they
clashes
do.
are something.
Yeah, they do create the grace and they do create the dissonances. Yes, and as you say, the singers, when they put a consonant before the beat, that's usually an unvoiced consonant rather than a
That's right.
voiced one. And
That's right.
if it's a voiced one, it has to be on the beat.
So we're
So
talking
so
about actual notes. We're talking about actual notes. We're not talking about something that we need to get out of the way for
yeah.
technical reasons. So
No,
they need to be
don't get the
treated
grace
as
notes out of the way. Enjoy them because
the
they're
actual
fun.
note.
They're
Yes,
dissonant fun. Yes.
it's a long trek to listen to my recordings for. It's 10 discs long. So I wouldn't expect anyone to be doing this in one sitting. But one thing that I was paying attention to was the dichotomy of the classical and romantic elements in Beethoven's music,
Mm.
uh, and that he does change his style from his early days to to his later
Yeah.
works.
Well, it
Uh,
changes every time. That's the trouble. But
and one of the things that I tried to do was in the earlier sonatas, maybe up to early middle period sonatas, I am starting the trills on the upper notes.
yeah,
As we evolve into his later, I start experimenting. Is it the upper note? I did allow for some trills to start on the main note.
yeah.
Does that sit well with you?
It's not very clear what's meant to happen with his later works. I mean, presumably, if he was brought up with trill beginning on the upper note and then he went deaf, he would assume that trill normally begin on the upper note rather than the main note. So I think even in the later works, I think there's a case to be made for beginning all trills on the upper note rather than the main note. But I think it doesn't matter all that much if you do some of the later trills on the main note, because it's not entirely clear which it should be. But I'm inclined to think he probably expected an upper note start all the way through.
There's so much unclarity when we go to his later uh, works, because people say, well, his metronome was broken, so out goes the metronome markings. He couldn't hear anything. Uh, his piano couldn't manage what he had written anyway. We have all these excuses for it. So do what you want, but I don't think you throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think
Mm.
the essence of Beethoven is there. I think there's a lot to pull out of the score, and I'm so glad that you really dug into all of the details, because we have so many questions. The later sonatas are so beautiful, and they sort of defy conventions, and I feel like he is trying to be as true to his sound world that he's hearing in his mind, and he wasn't going to let bar lines or meters or what people would expect. um, and never mind if it's difficult to play. So if it's longer trills and it feels really awkward in the hand, he doesn't care. He wants those trills.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And he does write the very difficult trills, and he writes very difficult passages generally. But as you say, the trills you just play as best you can. Because when he writes out I think he writes a fingering for the trill, doesn't he? In the last sonata, near the end of the last sonata, he actually puts a fingering in, and I think one of the trills are beginning on the upper note, and the lower trill beginning on the lower note. I think so, because you can't play it the other way very well. So he actually the fingering points to which note you should start on, but you don't usually get that, unfortunately.
Of course, a fugue is difficult in the hammer clavier.
Yeah.
Uh, and so one of the things that I did do in the slow movement was I did take it very slow, and then I took it even. So there are, I think the longest writ of all time, the two the two massive writs are in that movement,
Yes, they
and
are. Yes, yes. I mean, it starts not all that slow. I mean, 92 is not all that slow, and some players begin much too slowly, I think. But as you say, there are two very long writs which go on for about 6 or 7 bars, and if you're not careful, you come to a full stop altogether. So you have to sort of slow down very gradually. But it's an extraordinary passage that, yeah.
it is. It's almost like time is stopping. It almost feels like you have
Mm.
to just keep it going. So that was actually very difficult. Some people are thinking the speed of the hammer clavier, the first movement, is difficult. The speed of the fugue is difficult, but now we have to look beyond difficult and see. Okay, so let's get into his mind. Let's rebuild this. What was Beethoven? Where was he at this time? What is the spirit of this thing? You actually have to change as a performer. You have to be very open minded and use fingerings that I I came up with some interesting fingerings for scalar passages. Uh,
Yeah.
not so original, because also in that CPE book, there's different ways that you can finger
That's
major.
right, yeah. I mean, the fingering is a very personal thing because everyone's got different shaped fingers and different length of fingers, and so you
Absolutely,
can't really
absolutely.
lay down ideal finger. What I did make sure in my edition was that Beethoven's fingering, when he did put fingering in, I used very large figures of the size, well, so the size one would normally write in if one doing it by hand, and so any editorial fingering which was done by someone else um, is on as the normal sort of small figures. But if it's Beethoven's figure fingering, then I use very large fingers so you can't miss it. So you can see what fingering he suggested. And you didn't have to use it, but it shows what fingering he expected.
So what you were saying earlier about this isn't how I heard it before, this is not how other people do it, should not be your deciding factor, because YouTube recordings are very recent. I think if you're thinking about all the possibilities, all the colors, all the different things that you could do, we're going back to you should listen to some Schnabel, you should listen to Fort Wrangler recordings. You should listen to these people who said, "I'm doing come escrito," and not one performance is the definitive, the only recording. And also,
No.
Beethoven isn't around right now to tell us any different.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, there's a lot of flexibility within what is admissible. I mean, that you don't have to do it one way. There are a lot of ways you shouldn't do it if you want to do it his way. But his way does allow a certain amount of flexibility. He doesn't put a dynamic mark in every bar. You've got to adjust the voicing and so on, and depending on the piano and your feelings and so on. So there's quite a bit of flexibility within it, And of course, with the flexibility of tempo, you're not going to play in absolutely strict time the whole time. There will be some flexibility, and that's partly up to the performer to put the flexibility in as expressively as possible, I think. But and Beethoven's metronome marks are a pretty good guy, but he doesn't use them. He doesn't have them much for piano music for sonatas. So you have to try and work out on the basis of um, other works what he intended by particular marks. I've had a couple of PhD students actually working on the question of tempo in Beethoven, and they've come up with some quite interesting discoveries about how fast movements would be expected to go if you use a kind of formula, and that gives you some idea, which is usually in line with what pianists do, but sometimes not. And it's interesting where it's not in line with what pianists do, and it's usually in line with what Czerny recommends also, but again, sometimes not. And then it's interesting that there are differences.
You know, it, so not as a PhD, but as a MA student, the Beethoven Piano Society of Europe
Oh
published
yes.
Arietta magazine. This one is from 2000, and it has an article of mine, uh, performance practice in Beethoven, tempo modifications. And so
Mm.
all the way from back there, this is one of the questions that come because it's immediate. We're thinking, I'm not sure this tempo marking works. For example, in the first movement of the Hammerklavier, Beethoven writes half note or minim is at 138. A lot of performers and musicologists both have said that it's just too fast.
I agree, but I think that if you start off at 138, you can probably bend the speed a little bit and probably slow down from time to time. I think it tends to sound slightly better if you don't go 138 the whole time. It is possible, and Czerny says that. Czerny says that the chief difficulty of this movement is the tempo mark. You just have to practice it, which is fine. But yeah, I agree that I don't think the whole thing should go to 138, but I may be wrong there. Yes, my impression is his metronome was accurate. It did get broken down sometimes, so sometimes he couldn't use it. He may have misread it occasionally, and occasionally, of course, we get the wrong note value. So it says crotchet equals whatever figure, and it's really minim equals. So that sort of thing happens sometimes.
One of the most captivating traits of Beethoven's music is the range of his expressions, the explosiveness, the passion, the tragedy. Uh, he has all these, and I think according to our age, also we feel those differently. And like Glenn Gould, he had two goes at the Goldberg variations. I have a feeling that if everybody were to revisit their recordings, it would not be the same. They would probably make some certain decisions because as artists, we would feel struggle differently. We would feel pain, or we would have nostalgia. So
Yes,
there
some people will change much more than others, I expect. Some people will probably play the same piece the same way, but for many years. Other people will say, "No, I didn't like the way I played it then. I'd much rather have it like this." My own inclination is to use rather less pedal than I used to. I mean, I used to smudge the thing, used to have pedal all over the place, but having looked at Beethoven's pedal marks, I find that actually he's quite precise about where he puts the pedal in the later works.
yes,
And so there are places where people add pedal, and I think, well, if he wanted pedal there, he'd put pedal in the previous bar. If he wanted pedal in this bar, he'd put it in there as well, wouldn't he? And he hasn't done. So therefore, he presumably doesn't want pedal. And there are several places where I think where a lot of pianists put pedal in where I'm fairly sure he didn't want it. And so I've been looking into this quite a bit. And of course, the trouble with the early works is there's no pedal markings at all. So what I've been trying to do lately is to see the sorts of places he put the pedal markings in where he did use the pedal markings, and then see if one can, on the basis of that, does he change between middle Beethoven and late Beethoven? And the answer is no, he doesn't. And therefore, he presumably wouldn't change significantly with early Beethoven. And therefore, if you use the same system, you might be able to work out exactly where he would have been likely to put pedal markings in if he'd had the notation in the 1790s. Because this was the problem. There was no notation for pedal markings in the 1790s. So he couldn't put any pedal markings in because he didn't know how to write it down.
well, there were some. I think one of the things that we should do as performers is to look at performance practice. What did this contemporary say? Because there were a lot of things that were understood. If you were a trained pianist or musician, you would know what to do with this. They wouldn't need to write all these crescendos and decrescendos. If it's an ascending line, you assume there's going to be a crescendo, and vice versa if it's descending. If it's like this, then you do. So there are these understood things that didn't maybe make it into 2020. So
Yeah.
these are things that are passed from teacher to teacher, from teacher to student, uh, and some of them are gone. So you have to go back to writings. This is how I feel that performance is. This is how you treat this. And so we go back and read the treatises and hope and fill in some of the gaps.
Yeah.
He probably felt like he didn't need to put pedal markings because you should know what to do with the pedal.
Well, that's what people have said, and I found that's completely wrong, in fact, that he puts pedal markings in precisely where we'd expect the pedal markings to go most of the time. And he doesn't put pedal markings in where you wouldn't expect them most of the time, but occasionally he does because he wants a special effect. And the assumption that there was a kind of convention that would apply to dynamics because you can change those. But pedal was such a newfangled invention in the 1790s that there was no sort of standard way of using the pedal. And I think Milky Meyer says people mostly don't use the pedal at the moment. So he couldn't rely on convention for pedal markings. He could to a certain extent for tempo and crescendos and so on and flexibility, but he couldn't for pedal marking it because there was no convention. And even if there was a convention in Vienna, well, what happens when he sends some folk song settings to Scotland? How does he know whether the convention is the same there? So his pedal markings you might expect them to be different for the folk song settings he sent to Scotland, but they're not. He puts the pedal markings in the same sorts of place as he does in the sonatas. So in other words, he's putting the pedal markings where he wants them. And the implication is he probably mostly doesn't want them if he doesn't put it in the later works. In the early works, when there's no notation, obviously you have to work out the sort of context where he would put it in. I'm still working on that.
Uh, I have parked next to my Steinway a modern piano, an 1833 Broadwood, so a single action, so that I could see how fast. What can we expect from this kind of repeat?
Yeah,
How fast? How reasonable can we do? How much pedal sounding? Back then, 1833 is close. It's the same model, the same kind that Chopin took with him, with James Sterling over to Scotland. But it and it's not quite Beethoven. So I have been to the Beethoven Society in the San Jose State University. Um, it the dynamic range is a little bit less. The pedals, when you do this, when you do this, I'm not sure
yeah,
it sounds like that.
yeah. That sounds okay. Yes.
It's not all going to be blending. So I think you do have to consider, what does the modern piano allow me to do? How much would Beethoven have done if he had
Yeah.
this to his access?
Yeah,
Uh,
there are some times when the modern piano, the pedal effect of modern piano is much more prolonged than it was on a Broadwood piano or a Stein piano, so the sort he used, or Streicher piano. And so very often when he writes pedal, then half pedal on a modern piano would be roughly the same sound. So you can't just sort of shove your foot down the whole way all the time in that sort of context. You have to say what sound did he intend, and he intended something more like a half pedal sometimes. So you have to be quite careful there. But on the other hand, if he doesn't want any pedal, if he never writes censor ped like some composers might. So if he doesn't put a pedal mark in, he assumes it's censor ped, I imagine. And there are, in his early places where he started using pedal marks, he was using con sordino and senza sordino. Now he does seem to put con sordino, I mean no pedal at this point. And so I say if he doesn't actually put a pedal marking in, I'm hesitant to recommend adding pedal in such places, especially in the later works where his pedal markings are fairly frequent. So where if they're frequent pedal markings and there's none in a particular place, I'd be rather cautious about adding it there. In some cases you might want to, but mostly you'd be cautious. And even if he does put pedal marking, possibly sometimes half pedal might be more appropriate.
I took extra care in when we
Yeah.
have markings like there's no pedal.
No,
Most
no.
people do because for technical
Yeah.
reasons, and it causes a more resonance. And
Yeah.
but he didn't ask for it, so I'm always thinking,
Absolutely.
how
Yeah.
would it sound in a concert hall? How would it sound on his piano? And then playing it drier, playing it with a pedal, is it shorter? Is it there's so many considerations.
With that sort of context, I used to much prefer it with the pedal, but now I'm much more hesitant about putting a pedal in that bit of the hammer clavier because there's no pedal marking. And I say that if you think of Italian operas, very often the bass note in the slow aria is played right at the beginning of the bar, possibly a pizzicato, and then it doesn't sustain all the way through the bar. It's just a plink at the beginning of each bar, and that may be the effect that Beethoven was intending very often. Just a little plink in the bass at the beginning of each bar is all you need.
But I tell all my students, try what's on the page first
Mm,
before you
yeah,
fix it. Before you put it to what you think it ought to be. Try something
yeah,
different. He
yeah,
may have had a different idea. Try it.
yeah. That's right. If you play what it says on the score, you can't go far wrong, I find.
Do you think there will be another edition after this one? Is this a like
Well,
a
the my own edition has had one or two reprints with slight modifications. So I don't know whether you got the latest uh, incarnation of it or not, but particularly one of the second and third ones, the Leberwohl, a new source turned up after
oh
I'd published my edition, and so the new reprint of my edition includes material from that source, and a new source turned up for Opus 2, number 1. And so when my edition was reprinted, I changed one slur to allow for this new source. Nothing very substantial, but one slur is now different from what it was.
so another item that I think a lot of pianists today are not paying enough attention to are the slur markings. I think the
Yeah,
slur markings are uber important. It's
absolutely. Yes.
like the breath, and it's how you group. It's how you know that he is half sentence interrupting or if he's continuing, or there are
Yeah.
so many considerations like that. And do you keep this slur going, and what is going on in the left hand? Something has to let go. Which one is it? No, let's keep everything. There's
Yeah, there's a tendency to play much more legato now than there was in his day. Um, and, and in fact, in his day, at the time, I think legato playing was more common in England than it was in Vienna.
oh,
So if he doesn't put a slur in, he usually doesn't mean it to be legato. He means it's slightly detached. And I found this when I was editing a Clementi sonata. And at one point, he just has a string of semiquavers or something like that. And then he published it in Vienna and added the word legato
oh,
because he didn't need to in England because he knew people would play legato. But with the Vienna and a different sort of piano, he actually added the word legato to show that it's just to help the Viennese to play the way he expected. So in other words, they wouldn't play legato unless there was a slur.
I find Clementi sonatas to be slightly problematic because from edition to edition, the the differences are enormous. I think a lot
Yeah,
of
but he revised some of them. That doesn't help. Yes.
yes, I think the editors were looking at they're sort of like performance editions because I see that there's staccatos and legatos added in all sorts of places that are not done at all in another edition, and then some are missing dynamic marking
Yeah,
altogether.
you need to look at the Clementi Scholarly edition, the new Clementi edition, which you probably looked at for the most reliable text. But as you say, that some of the older editions have conflicting versions of text, makes it tricky.
Absolutely. But some of them are interesting to look back to so you can see what are performance ideas. Like you would look at,
Mm,
I was looking at Chernobyl edition to see what were some of his solutions to
mm.
make some things work, so he would actually mark faster here, faster, he actually has metronome numbers. So
Yeah,
you
he
can see
puts measure
yeah,
marks in,
faster
doesn't he? Yes.
and slower here. So I find that really interesting.
Yeah.
But it's his idea. It's a performance idea. I don't think it's that one way, and you shouldn't rely on it. I think you need to
Mm,
go back to Beethoven.
yeah.
As Busoni said, so there's three components of how a work is perceived, and a third of it is the composer's intent. A third of it is the performer. The performer needs to complete this work, and a third of it
Mm.
is the listener. The audience is listening. So it's what did they just hear? What are they fresh off of hearing? What are they comparing it to? Where were they just before they enter the concert hall? Is going to be part of the the final
Yeah.
experience of what is a work. Going on this theory, which I like a lot. So I try to bring in my responsible third. and not just take it literally like I'm typing out a text. You do need to bring in some interpretation. You do need to give it a lot of
Mm.
thought. You're not finished with a page, although even on the page we have an editor who is working around the clock
Mm.
to bring so much into there. In a live performance, I have them trapped in a chair, and I can see their faces, and we can react. So recording is difficult. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on the other side when people push the play button. But also, when you perform, you want to remove some of the shackles of this museum culture. Beethoven is precious, and it has to be a certain way. It has to please the musicologist. I think the composers today, the living composers, are happiest when they give me a score and I bring something to it and I say, I didn't hear that before. I didn't know that was, I
Yeah.
didn't expect that. That's something, uh, so I studied with Byron Janis, who studied with Horowitz, and so he had a lot of stories about being in the presence of Rachmaninoff or Horowitz playing, and they used to joke a lot. They used to have fun conversations, and uh, one instance, Horowitz was playing the second piano concerto, and Rachmaninoff was listening. This is not a concert; they were just doing dress rehearsal, and he did the extreme opposite of whatever the dynamic marks were to see what he would think. Rachmaninoff would sit back and say, yeah, I like it. It's good.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
So I'm not sure how much of that Beethoven was. Maybe on a good day, he'd be like, that's interesting. Oh, that's awesome. Because you're being true to your nature. You're bringing, you're really feeling the music. I'm sure he would have loved that.
Yes, there are one or two occasions where a performer did that and he was satisfied with, or even pleased. With other occasions, he was not so pleased. So it depends partly how it's done, I think, and what's done. And I say if you want to play it somewhere other than the way Beethoven intends, that's fine. And I say it might even sometimes be better than what he intended. Though that doesn't happen very often, I don't think. You can always improve his pieces. This is the thing. I mean, and we found that with Elisa, which was such a popular thing, you couldn't possibly improve that, and of course he did. And this is the fourth piano concerto. Also, he there's a much more elaborate version of that, which he played. So it is possible to improve on what he wrote, but it's quite difficult because usually if you play something other than what he wrote, it's not so good rather than better. But there may be occasions where it's just as good or even occasionally better. But achieving that is very difficult.
Yes, yes. And I think we're all terrified of the times that we are doing something he doesn't like because his reactions are famously so strong. And
Yeah,
so we
yeah,
we don't want to upset Mr. Beethoven.
yeah.
I'm hoping that this is a successful rendition and it's as faithful as I could be to an editor's work. I'm
Yeah,
not
that's
sure.
right. So if you're doing it, either you say I'm trying to do this as close as I can to what Beethoven intended, bearing in mind he didn't have very fixed ideas about this and that, or you say I don't care whether Beethoven liked it like this or not, but I like it like this, and I think this is the best way of playing it. But what I don't want is people to saying I'm trying to do it as Beethoven intended, and then doing something which he clearly didn't intend. I think that would annoy me if that happened. But if they make out to begin with that it's only their version of Beethoven rather than Beethoven's sonata itself, then that's okay. But if you say I'm playing a Beethoven sonata and you're not actually playing a Beethoven sonata, you're playing your version of it, then it's a more doubtful.
I'm telling everybody this, if you get this edition, it will save you 10 years of
I
self-study
don't know about that, but
and
I hope
research.
it will. Yes.
It pulls together so many ideas and puts it all in one place. So
Well, thank you.
we have to
That's
thank
how
you.
I try to do certainly.
I
The
trust you.
Associated Board were the ABRSM were a bit doubtful at first because they thought this is really odd. Well, does he really know what he's doing? They asked around and they were assured that people thought I did know what I was doing. So they said, okay, you can carry on doing it. And then they realized actually, yes, it probably don't want a clone of a different edition. It would be nice to have something different. So
Yeah.
so they were quite supportive. But at one stage they were so doubtful about my way out ideas that they were thinking of stopping altogether. Then they realized that my way out ideas were actually going to work.
I hope going forward everyone will call the complete works 35 and
Mm,
not 32. That would be fantastic.
absolutely, yeah.
If anything, you find out more of what you don't know, the more you go. I think, well,
Absolutely, yes, yes, yes. There's so much I don't know. And my biography of Beethoven is full of words like probably and evidently and apparently, and we think that and it seems that. Because so much you're never quite sure that this is the case or not. So you have to put in the probablys and apparentlys. Otherwise, you're saying something which you're not quite sure about.
You think by the end of recording or the end of writing many books, you think this is I'm getting somewhere, and now I'm an authority on, and I think
Hmm.
I was like, I
Yeah,
have more questions than I had before I started. Um,
absolutely. Yes, there are always more questions to answer. Yeah.
but
Hmm.
Professor Cooper, I thank you so much for spending time with me.
Yeah.
I learned so much. I think a
Well,
lot of people would learn too from hearing you speak.
Well, thank you very much for showing such enthusiasm and all your playing as well. And the questions you ask and the way you delve into things is very impressive because not every pianist does this. And you're really keen to explore what's going on and try to understand this music in a way that pianists so often don't do. They play it and they don't think about it as much as you have done. And the way you sort of compare it with orchestral music and vocal music and the question of tempos and all sorts of other things, the slurs and so on, these are all things which need to be thought about by every aspiring pianist, and so I hope aspiring pianists will more and more think along these lines, the way you're showing it, rather just my teacher says play it like this, so I'm going to play it like this, and that's that, which is so easily done by so many people who don't think what they're doing.